The principle I'm about to share with you is one of the most important things that I've learned myself as a business owner and a human, but it's also one of the two most important things that I believe as a parent, my job is to teach my kids. So it's really important. So I want you to set aside a bit of time now and watch this one and perhaps come back and watch it again and again so that you really get this into your head and start making better decisions of it. Because as a business owner, business is an intellectual sport, okay? It's mostly about how we think, not how hard we work. And this is going to give you a solid platform for how to make good decisions as we go forward. So here we go. As we're walking through life, going through life, we have this thing called the line of choice. And every instant we're making decisions about what we're going to do. We're either going to go above or below the line. So what does that mean? And I'm going to use the story of a fictional character. Let's call this person Joe. Joe could be a guy, could be a girl, doesn't matter. Joe's at this particular business and they have been there for quite some time. And it doesn't matter what the business is. In fact, you might know some of the Joes that have been in your business. Hopefully, you're not one of them. So first of all, Joe is a bit of a rock star in Joe's own mind. In fact, Joe thinks that the business wouldn't be what it is without him. Joe would come to a personal growth and development seminar, I guess you'd say, or a team meeting, and Joe sits around and thinks to himself, this is a load of rubbish. Goes outside of the meeting and badmouths the boss to everyone. Joe's in what we call a state of denial. Now, denial is not a river in Egypt. It's a state of mind where we are unaware of how we are behaving and the implications that it's having. So we might bring Joe into the boss's office and have a bit of a chat with him and explain to him that, Joe, look, this business has done pretty well without you. In fact, we'd probably go better if you weren't here. We know that you're bagging us out around the workplace behind everyone's back. See, up until this point, Joe hasn't had a clue. He thought she was getting away with it. So it's a bit of a harsh slap in the face for Joe to realise this. Usually what happens is Joe will then start to make excuses. And excuses could be things like, oh, you know what? How the hell can I be expected to work on this particular machine to produce the results that I need to when it's a poor machine? It doesn't work properly. So we bring Joe back into the office and we sit Joe down and we explain that while Joe was away last week, we had someone else working on the machine who actually had a 37% higher output than Joe ever has. So fundamentally, Joe, it's not the machine. Usually what someone will do next in this context, if they've been making a bunch of excuses, is they will start to blame other people. They will say things like, well, it's my wife, it's my ratty teenage kids, it's the government, it's everybody else. Would you like some cheese with that wine, Joe? Failing to take some responsibility for their own actions. They're all about blaming everybody else. It's never their fault, okay? We keep working with Joe, and you know what? Sometimes you can't help people with this, and that's okay. We free them up for their future somewhere else. We get people like this regularly throughout life. In fact, I would say this is a huge chunk of the population of what we call victims. Hopefully you don't see this person in the mirror on a regular basis. We keep working with Joe, as I said, and we start to get Joe to be more responsible. Now, if we look at the word responsible, it means we are able to respond. Particularly, I'm in Australia, and we are very lucky. We call ourselves the lucky country sometimes. We get to choose the responses that we make. So being able to respond and have choice in the matter is extremely important, particularly if you're in a country that lets you do that. Joe starts to become more responsible. Joe starts to become more accountable. Now, this course is called Find My Cash. Key word within accountable is count, keeping score. Life is largely about keeping score. How many times are you hitting your targets at work? How many times are you telling your loved ones that you love them? How many times are you doing exercise per week? How many calories are you eating a day? You see, at the end of the day, life is largely about a big count. So getting to be accountable and owning your numbers, which leads us to the next point, is ownership. Okay, where you are in your own ship. You get to choose the decisions you make and the results that you get. Now, sometimes you don't get what you want first time, and that's okay, but you've got to own it. People who play above the line in this context are what we call the victors. Now, here's the interesting thing. I've been teaching this principle to the people that I work with, my one-to-one clients, for a long time. And for a while, I noticed that their actions weren't matching their words. and I couldn't work out, maybe I haven't been teaching this correctly. So I started thinking about it, maybe there's a better way to do this. And I started coming up with some finer distinctions. Now, if you watch the I Know video, I talk about getting finer distinctions. And if you can imagine the curve you've seen a couple of times now, our exponential curve, finer distinctions, a little movement at the bottom of the curve at the front doesn't result in much change in the vertical axis. But if you get down the back on the curve and you make a tiny little bit of improvement, you can get quite a big jump. That's why finer distinctions are so important in your business. So I'm going to go through some finer distinctions now around above and below the line to help you really understand how important this is. And I bet you're going to see why this is something you've got to teach your kids. Because if I get my kids to really understand this principle, my job as a parent is done. So the first distinction we've got with above and below the line is above the line you get results. Below the line you get reasons. Now, fancy word reason is just another word for blame, excuses, and denial. Don't come up with a bunch of reasons around why you haven't achieved a particular result. You either get the result or you don't. If you're not going to put what you have into getting it, then don't start. Don't make commitments that you can't keep. Now, next as we're moving along is about finding how we're going to get proactive. What does proactive mean? Proactive versus reactive. So proactive, pro means forward. Reactive means to do it again. So you react. Do again, act the way you've always acted. This is such an important distinction. When you go above the line, quite often it's about making a proactive choice. I'm going to share a story with you around how I really got this. If you've heard of a guy called Tony Robbins, he's an educator, and I went to one of his workshops with 3,000 people in the room, and we played Simon Says. Now, I'm a little bit of a competitive type of person. I thought, for sure, I can win this. I can beat all 3,000 people. Now, I was out within the first couple of rounds. Anyway, that's another story. But Simon Says is an interesting game. The rules around Simon Says are that Simon says when you do something, anything that comes after the instruction, such as and, or, so forth, doesn't count. And this is where they trip you up. So the 3,000 people come down to just 6 on stage. So they're up on stage and they're all lined up, and Tony says to them, all right, so we're ready to play. Is everybody clear on the rules? Yep, we're ready to go. Okay, first instruction. Simon says, turn and face your partner. So what do you think most people did? Yep, most people did this. The winner of the game did this. And he kept going around and round in circles because Simon says turn and face your partner. So everything from and on didn't count. And he won some big prize, I can't remember what it was, but they asked him at the end of it, how come you, out of 3,000 people here, why do you think you're the one who won the game? And the guy stood there and he paused for a moment. And he said, every time you gave an instruction, I stopped, I thought about what you said, and then I took action. Most people in that game reacted. They didn't think. They didn't pause. They just reacted and done what they've always done. So if this is you within your life, are you pausing and stopping to think about the implications of the decision you're making? Are you proacting or are you being reactive? The next distinction, inside versus outside. Above the line is an inside game. You need to look inside of yourself first. Most people want to point outside when something goes wrong. It's very rare to find someone to go inside and ask themselves, okay, what was my role in this situation? We're usually way too eager to point the finger at other people. In fact, if I get you now to point your fingers at me, what you're going to notice is, Brad, it's your fault. There is one finger pointing at me. There is 3 fingers pointing back at you out of the 5. One's up to God, Allah, whoever, source, energy, universe, whoever you believe in. But 60% of it comes back on you. You're the one who's responsible here. Inside versus outside. Go inside first. Present and the future versus the past. This is a really interesting one. Let me ask you, if you think about some of the conversations you've been having with your friends and family or whoever recently, what domain of time do you find yourself talking in? Do you find yourself talking a lot about the past? What can you do about the past? Nothing. There is nothing you can do about the past. So if you're bitching and moaning, complaining about the past, there is nothing you can do about it. You're wasting your energy. What can you do about the present and the future? Your present is your point of power. You can make decisions. Just on the past, the one thing you can get from the past is lessons and learning. If you keep making the same mistakes again and again, then you're going around in circles. Make a different decision in the moment. Go forwards. Whenever I hang out with business owners and people who want to do well, they're always talking about what they're doing now and what they've got coming down the path. It's very rare they talk about the past other than to share what they've learned about something in the past. Once we've got our present and our future sorted out, now we need to be considering the next element, the next distinction, conscious versus unconscious. Now this is a really tricky one. See, a lot of people will never get this. It doesn't matter how I explain it to them, for whatever reason, they will stay unconscious. Change requires you to become consciously aware that there is a problem. Most people would rather not be aware of a problem, and it will remain unconscious within them. Now here's the thing, the above and below the line principle isn't a big stick for you to go around beating people up with. It's a reference for you, for the decisions that you make and the actions that you take and the consequences that occur because of it. So if someone doesn't get this, that's okay. That's not part of your journey. What we want to make sure is we're using this as a reference for ourselves so that we can get the lessons and we can move forwards and get what we need to get. Our next distinction, empowering versus disempowering. Following on from people who don't get this, have you ever been around really negative people? In the conversations, they're probably bitching and moaning about things in the past. What's that like for you? For me, it's a draining experience. They're like sapping the energy out of me. We want to be around empowering people. We want to have empowering thoughts. Now, I'm not saying you can be la-la off on the happy trails forever. Life goes up and down. It's how you look at what happens that decides how things are going to pan out for you. So being around zappers, people who give you energy, is a choice. Make sure that you're taking empowering options when you get to that line of choice as opposed to disempowering options, because disempowering options are a little bit draining. Our next distinction, growing and dying. Anything on planet Earth either lives or dies, and it's growing. So bugs, bears, people, plants, elephants, if it's alive on planet Earth, it is doing one of those two things, growing or dying. A tree doesn't get to a certain height and go, well, that's it, I'm done. I'm not growing anymore. A tree will continue to strive and grow. And as with it is for human beings as well. If you think, no, I'm cruising along doing okay, then there's a good chance you're actually dying. In fact, I can tell when I go into a business within about 30 seconds of being in through the front reception area if they're growing or dying. And you'll know what it's like if you've ever been to like a doctor's surgery or something and they've got magazines that are there from 10 years ago. There's probably a good chance that they're not evolving. The only thing that doesn't change in life is that everything changes. And right now is the slowest pace of change we're ever going to experience. It's just going to keep changing faster and faster. So if you're not growing to keep up with it, then you're dying. Now, we all go through a little bit of dying phase at some stage, but as long as we don't keep dying, we want to keep growing. I see businesses that start in their business and they're all positive and they're growing and going for it, and they get to a point where they go, hey, we've made it, we're doing all right, money's going good and so forth. And sadly, I see them then die for the next 3, 5, 10 years in business because they didn't keep changing and growing and evolving. So make sure you're not on that side of the ledger. Acceptance versus justification. And if you ask any business owner, this you'll be able to resonate with. Something happens and a team member comes up and all they want to do is justify. And they're making excuses and giving you a big long story about what happened. It's in the past. It doesn't matter. Accept it. If something goes wrong, accept it. Now, if you watch my interview, my first video that I do within this course, I talk about my experience of working at Stadium Australia for the Sydney 2000 Olympics. And I've got a great story here for you about how this unfolded. So I was in charge as an electrical engineer of coordinating a lot of the electrical services that were happening at Stadium Australia for the Olympics. And we had a major instance whereby we needed to do some fairly significant work on one of the switchboard rooms. That involved shutting down the power to that for one night so that we could go in and clean it all out. So I spoke to all the different stakeholders who were involved with this and explained what we were doing and organised the shutdown, and it happened. So I leave work at the end of that day, go home knowing what was going to happen that night, come in the next morning thinking everything's fine. My phone didn't ring in the middle of the night. I thought everything's great. Sitting at my desk, and I had an office within the stadium, and I see this posse of people coming from one of the organisations within the Olympic big bandwagon show, if you like, and they were not happy. And I thought, oh wow, someone's going to get in big trouble here. Didn't realise who it was going to be. They come through the door using expletive words about who turned the switchboards off last night. It was me. What I didn't realise at the time was that IBM and all of our major communicators and major power supplies to things like backup signals for timing and all those sorts of things were on that switchboard. So in the middle of the night, when this power went off, alarms were going off everywhere in the people who were related to these systems. So I had a choice to make then, that line of choice. I could either pretend to make up some fluffy story, or I could just accept what happened. And I chose the latter. I stood up and I said, it was me. I coordinated that last night. I messed up. I'm sorry. Now this group of people coming towards me just froze in their tracks because they were expecting a big fight, you know. And something like the Olympics is very political, and you had to sort of be justifying and so forth to keep yourself not necessarily employed, but you get the point. They were dumbstruck that I actually took ownership. In fact, they just stood there and went, well, don't do it again. And they turned around and walked back out again. So when the you-know-what hits the fan, own it. Don't give people the story. They really don't care anyway, for a start, about the story that you're telling. Take full acceptance of it and move on. It is way much less painful that way. In fact, one of the things I teach my kids is tell a lie, you put it in the future. Tell the truth, you put it in the past. The sooner you deal with something that's gone wrong, the sooner you can get through it and move on to the next phase. Our next part and final part in our distinctions here is the soul versus the ego. I'm going to start with the ego part first, because I'm pretty convinced, looking at history, that ego is the source of a lot of the problems we've had on planet Earth. We back ourselves into a situation where we feel we have to defend our ego, which usually ends up in a whole bunch of stuff way worse than if we'd have just taken acceptance of it in the first place. Playing according to your soul, you know, your true authentic self. Integrity is key in business. Once you lose it, you can't get it back. So playing at a soul level, an authentic level, a genuine level is so important. So once I've explained this to you, hopefully you're starting to get some finer distinctions and really get what this means. But here's the key to it all. I can distill this down into one really simple task. Now, as I said, no one lives above the line all the time. In fact, if you've ever heard of a guy called the Dalai Lama, he's the head of the Buddhist monk movement, right? And I've heard him talk, and he used languaging and so forth, that he was going below the line. Now, here's a guy who meditates for 8 hours a day, and he still goes below the line. But here's the key. It's not about living above the line all the time. It's about catching yourself below the line and getting yourself up to above the line as fast as you can. In fact, what I've seen over the years, the faster you get above that, the more ownership, the more you start to master your life. And there's one key word that defines how to do this. If there's one thing I want you to get out of this principle, it comes down to this: your ability to be vulnerable. Now, this is really scary for a lot of people, but in a weird way, you might think that this is one of your most scariest things that you can do, where you feel the most vulnerable, but it's also, opposite-wise, the most powerful thing you can do. Because by the time you are being that vulnerable and you're in control of your situation, no one can, take advantage of you or do the wrong thing. So that's above and below the line. Think about your kids. If you can get them to understand this principle and live it, do you think your job as a parent is done? Absolutely. I'm pretty sure mine is. Let's strive to be above the line.